primary goal of propaganda is to influence the lens through which the population views an issue, to make aspects of war seem more positive than they are, or to make the enemy look like the bad guy, when both sides of the war are in the wrong. During the early and middle 1900s in Soviet Union Russia, propaganda was spread to shape citizens' opinions into whatever their government believed. Propaganda was the biggest tool during the war effort that could not only shift public opinion, but deter the opinions of their enemies. This was done through radio broadcasts and government control of all media, specifically newspapers, films, and direct announcements to citizens. These announcements allowed governments to broadcast their messages to listeners across the world. In the end, the government used propaganda to rally support for the war effort. In our project, we look specifically at these posters involved in the Soviet Union's propaganda regime. In the article by Karl C. Burkhoff, Motherland in Danger, Soviet Propaganda During World War II, he talks about the various purposes propaganda had in the Soviet Union. The main points being shown through images of war, patriotism, and industrialism. In addition to these methods, gaining war support was a huge factor for the Soviet propaganda, an ideal that was commonly known as nationalism. Our primary source consisted of a variety of different propaganda posters used to accomplish this goal from the 1980s time period. An example of a propaganda poster used depicts a Soviet Union soldier pointing out to the public saying, "Have you volunteered?" This poster demonstrates how the Soviet Union government aspired to rally support for the war and increase nationalism in order to fit their agenda. The war began after Germany invaded Poland, which created the means for the Axis powers to form. The Soviet Union initially remained neutral, while other countries, such as Britain and France, declared war on Germany. 2 years later, in 1941, Germany launched an invasion on the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. This was a breach of a treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which divided Eastern Europe into Germany and Soviet spheres of influence. This officially dragged the Soviet Union into World War II. During this time, the Soviet Union began to ask its people to help contribute to the war effort through propaganda. In this poster, we see an image of a woman working in a factory. There is an army of citizens below them, which represents Soviet Union citizens lining up to join the war effort. This emphasizes the working class citizens doing their part to contribute to the war effort in the Soviet Union. The message of industrialism and nationalism is clear. Like the woman who helps the government by doing manual labor jobs. During the war effort, women had to take on more factory jobs than men would usually do. The Soviet Union is using propaganda to rally support for the war effort. This is shown by a woman taking on a job in a typically male-dominated field. The images in this poster are designed to make the viewer think, if she can do it, why can't I? In another poster relating to industrialism, we are shown a picture of a man hammering down pieces of metal on an anvil. These bullets are then being shot straight at what is portrayed as the enemy, Nazis. Manufacturing weapons and vehicles like these were common in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union manufactured trucks, airplanes, tractors, and tanks to aid in their war effort. They were also big on exporting materials such as oil and iron. During the war, Soviet production of war materials was greater than that of Nazi Germany due to the growth and advancement of Soviet industrial production over the years before World War II began. This was due to Stalin's rapidly growing industrialization program, which brought jobs to many and dwindled the unemployment problem in Russia. This can be seen in the cargo ship poster reading, "We are going full steam ahead into industrialization and socialism." Industrialization played a big role in the Soviet Union, in not only the war effort, but aiding in their economy.
World War II was called the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union. This stems from the effect the war had on patriotism and nationalism in the Soviet Union. Within the first few years of the war, Germany took major Soviet cities, which impacted the industry in the Soviet Union as well as the citizens living there. In this poster, we see a man holding a flagpole centered around a red globe, which emphasizes the point of patriotism in the Soviet Union. Running along the flagpole, it says, "The working class must protect the motherland." One of the key themes we see in this poster is patriotism and nationalism. During any war, the most important thing is having the support of the people behind the war effort. The Soviet Union knew this and made propaganda to aid. The Soviet Union were acknowledged by their counterparts for having a great deal of success in the field of propaganda and swaying the tides of war with it. Citizens were known to take extreme pride in their country and backing it up in many ways. This citizen is backing up his country, which is the propaganda in this piece. The message of the poster was clearly to help the war effort in any way possible. This can be seen in the poster of a woman holding up a flag with a man which reads, "Long live the Commissar." This shows camaraderie between citizens, which also goes along with the ideas of communism supported in the Soviet Union at this time. The word commissar here is talking about the young working class in the Soviet Union who were also called upon to help and aid in the war effort. In an article by Benno Nitziel, Knowing the Enemy, he takes a deep dive into history of propaganda and looking at battles that occurred between various world powers like the Soviet Union and Germany. Nitziel states that in 1940, propaganda towards the enemy was assigned to the 7th Department of the Political Administration of the Red Army. It was given its own sector in the government because they knew the power was behind propaganda. This was around the peak of the war starting to unfold on the western front of Russia. The emphasis was to express to the people the need for their support in the war and that they need all arms united to win the war, not just abroad but in the homeland. The working class citizens making the weapons and supplies for the war were just as important in protecting Russia as the soldiers fighting. Without the backing of citizens, fighting a war is near impossible. Propaganda during this time aimed to influence the whole country behind an idea, which is why we can see the flagpole being held over a red sphere emphasizing communism uniting to fight together. Another attempt to emphasize patriotism was through the call to war. This can be seen in some of the posters, one of which is a Soviet Union soldier getting ready for war, but with a caption that reads, "Let's go to Berlin." This propaganda was used to try and influence the Soviet peoples to help reclaim its lost territory, which the Soviet Union would then further industrialize. Another point of emphasis we see in Nitziel's article and his explanation of the Soviets' use of propaganda in the war, specifically its development and growth into becoming a major part of the tactics in World War II. He states that the hope behind the propaganda was to persuade the German soldiers that they were on the losing side and that defeat was only a matter of time. This was psychological warfare used to deteriorate the Germans' mentality in the war and benefit the Soviet Union. It is argued that the Russian strategy, coordination, and communication had a use in the Soviet Union's victory overcoming Germany and the rest of the Axis powers. The main point is that the Soviet Union's quick reaction to conflict and their decisive strategies helped play a role in their victory. This was in part due to the propaganda used by the Soviet Union.
One poster in particular was an image of three red men on a black background taking apart a swastika by hand. The people in this poster are shown in a red color to emphasize the viewer's idea of communism, which is often depicted by this color. This was to portray an emphasis on defeat and spread the idea that the Nazi regime was weak and coming to an end at the hand of a much larger, more dominant Soviet Union. We know that at this time, posters were being made. Germany and Russia were at the height of the conflict with each other. The idea behind this was not only to show the Russian people, but also the German soldiers the regime of the Nazis was coming to an end, and that the Russian people were the ones who were going to do it. This idea sparked a great sense of nationalism and pride in the Soviet Union, while also playing a part in the turmoil of the Nazi soldiers' pride. Looking at another propaganda poster, you can see in one of them the Allied power, which in this case is the Soviet Union, holding Hitler at gunpoint. It's clear just by looking at the details they made their enemies seem weak and shriveled, while keeping their side strong and triumphant. This was to show the Nazis were worse than the Soviet Union. The people of the Soviet Union were able to view themselves as superior by seeing themselves overpower the Nazis. In another poster, there are three sections, two with Russia defeating the Crusaders and running them out, and in another with Hitler being rolled over by a tank. If you look into the way that these are drawn, you can see them making a mockery out of their enemies. The poster shows Russia stabbing them in the butt, which is usually a cartoonish way of making fun of someone and belittle them. They also make Hitler's image seem hopeless, like they've already destroyed the enemy, by showing his tank destroyed and his facial expressions scared. This is a representation that they defeated the Germans before throughout history, and that history will repeat itself again. With that being said, Russia has many wars where they defeated the Germans, such as the Battle on the Ice. This was a war in the mid 1200s between the Teutons and the Novgorods, in which the Novgorods, the Russians, won. Again, in World War I, the Germans were driven out by Russia, and lastly, with World War II, after making the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany broke the pact and it ended up costing them the war. It is through these posters that the Soviet Union was able to successfully industrialization war efforts and increasing overall unity and pride of the Soviet Union in their communist regime. They were able to show industrialism through the growth of the production and urbanization that relieved the high unemployment level and added the pride and nationalism in the nation. To call war throughout The call to war throughout propaganda brought them more soldiers and aided their efforts to take down the Germans. This was seen across various posters emphasizing the imminent and inevitable defeat of the German soldiers at the hand of the almighty Soviets. The Soviet Union was far better off after the implementation of the propaganda, and it showed in full colors during this time period.